What if one election could decide not just who leads a country, but whether that country finally escapes years of chaos or sinks even deeper into it? Tonight, all eyes are on Peru, where one of Latin America's most unstable democracies is once again staring into the abyss. The presidential runoff is so close that both candidates are effectively claiming momentum. Both sides are telling supporters to stay alert, and the final result may not be known for days, possibly even weeks. On one side is Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of one of Peru's most controversial leaders, promising a hardline war on crime. On the other is Roberto Sánchez, a left-wing lawmaker promising structural change, redistribution, and a bigger role for the state. And hanging over everything is one haunting fact: Peru is about to get its ninth president in a decade. This is not just an election. It is a stress test for the Peruvian state, for Latin America's political direction, and for whether democracy can still produce stability in a country exhausted by crisis. Welcome back to the channel. If you follow global politics, this is one of those stories that looks like a local election at first glance, but the deeper you go, the more it becomes a window into the biggest forces reshaping the world right now: political fragmentation, distrust in institutions, crime-driven populism, rural versus urban polarization, market fears, and the ideological struggle over who benefits from national wealth. Peru's runoff has turned into a perfect storm of all of those forces at once. The quick count from Ipsos showed Roberto Sánchez with 50.3% and Keiko Fujimori with 49.7%, a margin so tiny that Reuters described it as a statistical tie. BBC reported that official results also confirmed an extremely tight race, while both campaigns urged supporters to remain vigilant as votes continued to be tallied. This means Peru is not simply choosing a president. It is reliving its deepest divisions in real time. To understand why this runoff feels so explosive, you have to understand just how broken Peru's political system has looked for years. The country has cycled through president after president, impeachment after impeachment, scandal after scandal. One major reason is that no party has been able to establish stable control over Congress, creating a permanent state of confrontation between the executive and legislature. BBC's reporting before the vote captured the mood perfectly. Many Peruvians are not even entering this election with hope so much as fatigue. They want the instability to end so the government can actually focus on the issues hitting ordinary life: crime, corruption, inflationary pressure, inequality, public services, and whether people in rural Peru will ever feel represented by the capital. That background is why this runoff feels bigger than a normal left versus right contest. For many voters, it is a desperate search for basic governability. The numbers tell a dramatic story, but the geography tells an even more important one. Reuters reported that Fujimori dominated Lima, the urban vote, and much of the coast, while Sánchez swept rural areas and the Andean highlands. In other words, Peru is not just politically divided. It is territorially divided, economically divided, and socially divided. One electorate is anchored in the capital, in urban security concerns, in market stability, and in a preference for familiar power structures. The other is rooted in poorer and more rural regions where people feel Peru's mineral wealth has passed them by, and where demands for deeper reform remain powerful. This is exactly why early official tallies could show Fujimori ahead before later counts tightened. Lima's votes tend to be processed first, while Sanchez's strength comes from more remote areas counted later. That creates suspense, but it also reveals something deeper. Peru contains two political nations moving in opposite directions. Keiko Fujimori is one of the best-known names in Peruvian politics, and this runoff marks her fourth presidential bid. Her campaign message is built around one word above all others: security. Peru has been gripped by fear over crime, extortion, and rising violence, and Fujimori has leaned heavily into a tough-on-crime image. BBC reported from Lima's San Juan de Lurigancho district, one of the country's most populous and insecurity-hit areas, where supporters praised her promise to use the military against organized crime. In another BBC report, transport workers described extortion demands, shootings, and the constant fear of being killed on the job. One bus driver said gang violence had left him physically wounded and mentally scarred, while security officials described multiple attacks on drivers, including deaths. For many voters, especially in Lima, this makes Fujimori's message emotionally powerful. She is presenting herself as the candidate of force, deterrence, and immediate state response. But Keiko Fujimori's appeal comes with a heavy historical shadow. She is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, the former president who remains one of the most polarizing figures in modern Peruvian history. Supporters credit him with defeating insurgent violence and restoring order in the 1990s. Critics remember authoritarianism, human rights abuses, and the damage done to democratic institutions. BBC noted that Keiko actively leaned into her father's legacy during the campaign, promising a hardline response to criminal groups and invoking the image of a state willing to act decisively. For some Peruvians, especially those terrified by today's crime wave, that legacy looks like strength. For others, it looks like a warning. That is the central gamble of her campaign. She is betting that fear of disorder now outweighs fear of authoritarian overreach. If Fujimori is running as the candidate of order, Roberto Sánchez is running as the candidate of rupture. He has promised sweeping reforms to the state and the economy, including a greater role for the state in natural resources, more investment in rural regions, tax reforms, and a review of mining contracts. His argument is simple and powerful. Peru is rich in gold, copper, and other resources, but too much of that wealth is concentrated, and too little reaches ordinary citizens, especially outside Lima. That message has connected strongly in rural and Andean areas, where many voters feel locked out of the nation's prosperity. BBC reported that Sánchez supporters see this election as a vote for change and even threaten protests if they believe that change is being denied again. For them, this is not abstract ideology. It is a struggle over whether Peru's economic model serves the nation or just its elite centers of power. Sánchez also carries his own baggage. He served in the government of former President Pedro Castillo, the left-wing leader who was jailed after trying to dissolve Congress and rule by decree. BBC reported that Sánchez has reiterated support for a presidential pardon that would free Castillo, a position that energizes some supporters but alarms moderates who fear institutional breakdown. The New York Times preview described Sánchez as a political heir to Castillo, though it also noted that in the final stretch of the campaign, he tried to pivot toward the center by promising fiscal responsibility, private property protections, and central bank autonomy. That tells you something important. Sánchez knows that to win, he cannot rely only on anti-establishment passion. He also has to calm the fears of middle-class and business voters who worry that his reforms could trigger economic turbulence. What makes this election so gripping is that both sides are responding to real crises, just different ones. On the one hand, Peru's crime problem is severe and visceral. Extortion and homicide have surged. Transport workers are being threatened or killed, and public confidence in state authority has eroded. Reuters, BBC, and other reports all identify insecurity as one of the top issues driving the vote. This naturally benefits a candidate like Fujimori, who can package herself as the law and order option. But on the other hand, Peru's social and economic divide remains just as politically explosive. Sánchez's support is strongest in areas where voters feel ignored by Lima's political class and unconvinced that Peru's market economy has worked for them. So the country is caught between two urgent demands: protect us now and transform the system that failed us. And when a country faces both at once, elections stop being policy debates and start becoming identity battles. That is why the runoff has felt emotionally combustible from the start. BBC reported that after the chaotic first round, accusations of fraud and threats of protest were already in the air. Anadolu reported both camps telling supporters to stay vigilant while every tally sheet was counted. Reuters reminded readers that Peru has seen this movie before. In the 2021 runoff, Fujimori lost by an even narrower margin, and the final proclamation dragged on for weeks amid challenges that were ultimately rejected. In that sense, the danger is not just who wins. The danger is what the losing side believes happened. In a polarized country with deep mistrust of institutions, a paper-thin result can deepen instability even before the next president takes office. Outside Peru, investors are watching this race nervously, and for good reason. Peru is a major exporter of copper and other critical minerals, and that makes its political direction matter far beyond its borders. Sánchez's proposals to review mining concessions, raise certain corporate taxes, and give the state a larger role in natural resources have unsettled financial markets. Reuters and BBC both noted that markets have been rattled by the possibility of a Sánchez victory, especially as polls tightened. Fujimori's supporters argue that Peru's relatively stable macroeconomic model must be preserved. Sánchez's supporters respond that the current model may look stable on paper, but it has failed to distribute wealth fairly in practice. So again, the divide is profound. One side says don't break what still works. The other says it only works for some people. And that economic debate is not happening in a vacuum. It is tied directly to geopolitics, commodity flows, and the global competition for strategic resources. When Peru argues over mining contracts or control of natural resources, it is also arguing over how much leverage the state should have in a world that increasingly values the minerals under Peruvian soil. For an American audience, this matters because Peru is not some isolated crisis. It is part of a broader contest across the developing world over whether market-friendly models can survive public anger over inequality, and whether resource nationalism will gain strength as governments look for new ways to satisfy frustrated voters. One reason international media are paying close attention is that this election is being framed as a test of Latin America's broader political trajectory. Reuters, in the Internationale version of its report, described the contest as a test of the region's rightward shift, pointing to recent right-leaning victories in countries such as Chile, Argentina, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and what it characterized as the end of 2 decades of socialist rule in Bolivia. The New York Times similarly described an anti-incumbent wave pushing parts of Latin America toward the right. If Fujimori wins, many analysts will read it as another case of crime, insecurity, and anti-left backlash boosting a conservative candidate. If Sánchez wins, it will suggest that left-wing redistributive politics still retain serious power when inequality and rural exclusion remain unresolved. In other words, Peru's runoff is now being watched as a regional signal, not just a national result. But Peru may also be a warning against overly neat regional narratives. This is not simply a right versus left story. It is also a story of anti-incumbent frustration, weak institutions, regional inequality, and a public that no longer trusts traditional political formulas. A Fujimori win would not necessarily mean Peru has solved its instability problem. A Sánchez win would not necessarily mean the left has found a sustainable governing model. Whoever takes office will still face a fragmented Congress, a suspicious opposition, and a public that has run out of patience. Peru's pattern over the last decade suggests that winning power is only the beginning. Surviving in power is the real challenge. If you are wondering why a modern election can remain unresolved for so long, Peru's political history provides the answer. First, the margin is tiny. Second, different regions are counted at different speeds, which can create dramatic swings over time. Third, both camps know that every decimal point matters, so they are pushing supporters and poll watchers to defend every tally sheet. Anadolu quoted Fujimori saying it would be irresponsible to define the result based only on a quick count sample, while Sánchez said authorities had a responsibility to safeguard every vote. Reuters and BBC both noted the strong possibility of prolonged counting and recounts, especially given Peru's experience in 2021. So even if one candidate seems to have momentum in the headlines, the political battle may be just entering its most sensitive phase. That delay matters because it creates a dangerous vacuum. Rumors spread. Supporters get restless. Losing narratives harden before facts are final. And in Peru, that can quickly translate into street pressure. BBC reported that some Sánchez supporters were already openly talking about protesting if he did not win. At the same time, Fujimori's camp was calling for vigilance and insisting every single tally sheet must be counted. That combination, extreme polarization, institutional distrust, and a razor-thin margin, is exactly how election disputes become national crises. One of the most revealing elements in the reporting is not the statistics, but the mood. BBC's on-the-ground interviews captured 2 countries talking past each other. Some Fujimori supporters spoke as if crime has become so intolerable that only force can restore normal life. Some Sánchez supporters spoke as if Peru's existing system is so unfair that only structural change can restore dignity. Students interviewed by BBC sounded tired, skeptical, and trapped between two options they did not fully trust. One young voter described the choice as the lesser evil. Another warned that Fujimorism represents authoritarian fear. Another said he would vote critically for Sánchez simply to block her. That is a striking portrait of a democracy where even politically engaged citizens do not sound empowered. They sound cornered. And maybe that is the deepest takeaway from all of this. Peru is not just polarized because people passionately believe in opposite futures. It is polarized because huge numbers of people feel abandoned in the present. They fear violence. They fear corruption. They fear more instability. They fear that if their side loses, the country will slide further away from justice or security or democracy. That level of fear can win elections, but it rarely produces reconciliation afterward, which means the next Peruvian president may win the vote and still inherit a country that feels almost impossible to govern. So here's the big picture. Peru's runoff is a dead heat between two radically different answers to the same national breakdown. Keiko Fujimori says Peru needs order, force, and economic continuity. Roberto Sánchez says Peru needs redistribution, reform, and a state that finally works for the forgotten majority. One draws power from fear of crime. The other draws power from anger over inequality. One is strongest in Lima and the coast. The other is strongest in rural Peru and the Andes. One carries the memory of authoritarian order. The other carries the legacy of a jailed leftist movement that many Peruvians still see as betrayed. And whichever one wins, Peru will still wake up the next day with a fractured Congress, a polarized public, and a democracy that has already burned through 8 presidents in 10 years. And that is why this story matters far beyond Peru. Because in one election, you can see the pressures reshaping democracies everywhere. Insecurity pushing voters towards strongman politics. Inequality fueling demands for radical change. Exhausted institutions struggling to hold legitimacy. And societies dividing into rival realities that no longer trust each other. Peru may be choosing a president, but it is also revealing something larger about the age we are living in.